Thank you, Mr. Lewis. I appreciate you being here. Looking at some notes here, dated December 31st. These are your notes. Also looking at some notes taken by Joe Price, the CFO at Bank of America, that were taken on December 21st of 2008 about the attempt to pull use the MAC clause and get out of the Merrill Lynch transaction. In those notes, it says, fire board of directors if you do it. Irresponsible for country. Tim G. agrees. Tim G., I would assume, would be Timothy Geithner?
Those are Joe Price's notes?
Yes.
I would have to assume with you, because they're his notes.
Based on your recollection of what was going on in that, and based on the notes that we see from the CFO that was there, fire board of directors if you do it. Was that your understanding?
That is probably a reference to the conversation I've mentioned that I had with Secretary Paulson. But again, those are his notes.
But based on your personal recollection, is that your understanding that the board of directors would be let go if this MAC clause was invoked?
I mentioned that I need a license with whether he said could or would, but basically the premise was that management and the board would be removed if, in fact, we did call
including yourself.
Correct.
And so if the suggestion from the federal government was to have your job removed as well as the board of directors, can it be looked at any other way other than a threat?
Well, actually, we didn't actually have much of reaction to the comments themselves as it related to us being removed. Again, what impressed us was here was the government telling a bank in good standing that they would do something like this. And so it was the seriousness with which the seriousness of it, and which caused us to believe that they really did believe that there was an issue here with the MAC and not calling it that did influence us. But it wasn't the threat to have us lose our jobs. It was the seriousness. It was because they made it, not the threat itself.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last part of that.
It was the seriousness with which they made it, not the threat itself.
Tell me about your discussion. You call at one point, as I'm looking at the timeline here, and Mr. Paulson is taking a bike ride, I guess, on December 21st. Tell me specifically what was going on in that conversation.
Well, I called him to get an update, and I think that was the Sunday. I'm pretty sure that was the Sunday that I called him, and as I recall the conversation, he said, "I want to give you some blunt language, and I first want to start out by saying that we are very supportive of Bank of America," and then went one step further and said what I've already said, that okay, he said, but we feel very strongly that you should not call the MAC, and if in fact you do, and again, I think he said would, but it was would or could, as I recall, and remove the board and management.
Well, that certainly sounds like a threat to me, and an amazing use of power there. Tell me about your interactions with Timothy Geithner. How early in this process was he involved and engaged in this process?
I had no after the confirmation hearings, or once he excused himself from the New York Fed, I had no contact with Mr. Geithner.
But he was involved before he was named and brought in as the Treasury Secretary, correct?
Well, he had been involved in the original TARP money, yes.
Right. And tell me about Mr. Summers, so the interaction and place of involvement that he had in this process.
I personally had no involvement with Mr. Summers.
It was not engaged in any of these. Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent that Mr. Price's notes from December 21st, 2008, and Mr. Lewis's notes from the conversation with Ben Bernanke on December 31st, 2008, also be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you.
So ordered.
Tell me about the interaction that you continue to have with Mr. Bernanke and Mr. Geithner at this point.
Well, I've had very little conversation with. In fact, I can't recall of a conversation that I've had with Mr. Bernanke in terms of being one-on-one. I'm a member of a council called the Federal Reserve Advisory Council, and we there are 12 of us, and we have a dialogue with the Federal Reserve, including Mr. Bernanke, but that's in a group setting. And so
any interaction with the administration at all about your testimony?
May I say, gentlemen from Utah, your time has
My apologies,
expired.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Right. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland,